Forget the glossy Hollywood sets, guys. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping straight into the gritty, totally unfiltered history of New York City's immigrant underworld. You know, if you think television shows gave you the ultimate story of stylish, street-smart criminal crews, well, brace yourself. Because the real history, it's far more expansive, ambitious, and just plain wilder than literally anything you've seen on screen. Okay, let's dive into this. Was there a real New York City Peaky Blinders? Well, the short answer is no exact gang went by that name over here. But the reality completely subverts our expectations. New York possessed this massive underworld engine of crews that made those fictionalized gangs look like minor league players. Just consider the myth versus the reality for a second. The Birmingham myth usually centers on localized street gangs from the 1880s to the 1920s, right? Famous for razor blades and caps and small-scale neighborhood brawls. But in stark contrast, the New York City reality was fueled by immense size and huge waves of immigration. We're talking massive organized rackets, deep political ties to Tammany Hall, and sprawling multi-ethnic criminal empires. The sheer scale was absolutely staggering. Section 1. Forging the 5 points. Desperation in the slums. To really understand these empires, we gotta start at ground zero, the overcrowded, disease-ridden slums of Lower Manhattan in the 1840s and 50s. This is where we see the raw chaos of the 5 points, with groups like the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys. By the 1860s, a group called the Whyos takes control. Moving into the 1890s, we hit the massive street armies of the Eastman and Kelly Wars, which eventually professionalized into the Prohibition syndicates of the 1920s. It's an incredible evolution from raw street brawls to highly structured operations. In those early days, the rivalries were fierce and visually distinct. You had the Dead Rabbits, who were mostly Irish immigrants driven over by famine, clashing in these massive street conflicts. Their fierce rivals were the nativist Bowery Boys. These guys were native-born Americans, often volunteer firemen, easily recognizable by their bright red shirts and tall stovepipe hats. These two groups violently clashed just for mere survival, culminating in terrifying events like the infamous 1857 riot, where literally hundreds fought with clubs, knives, and bricks. And this brilliantly illustrates what happened next. By the 1860s, the streets saw their next evolution, the Whyos. Named for their distinct owl-like Why-O street call, they took that street chaos and literally turned it into a business. No joke, they operated with an audacious, printed menu-like price list for crimes. Whether you needed someone punched, pickpocketed, robbed, or even murdered, the Whyos had a set price. They completely dominated Manhattan by fully commodifying violence. Section 2. The Peak Street Gang Wars. Armies of the Underworld. By the time we hit the 1890s, localized street crews had escalated from neighborhood toughs into veritable urban armies. 1,500. Let that sink in. This wasn't a dozen guys plotting in a pub somewhere. This jaw-dropping number represents the massive membership of Paul Kelly's 5 Points Gang. When you compare that to the small neighborhood crews we see in TV dramas, it becomes super clear we are talking about militant, large-scale operations dominating entire city grids. This whole era was defined by two larger-than-life crime bosses. On one side, you had Monk Eastman, born Edward Osterman, a Jewish crime boss commanding over 1,000 members and totally controlling the Lower East Side. His ultimate rival was Paul Kelly. Kelly was an Italian-born ex-boxer, originally named Paolo Vaccarelli, commanding those 1,500 members of the 5 Points Gang. These two titans fought unbelievably bloody, multi-ethnic turf wars over highly lucrative gambling and protection rackets. Naturally, the tension between these two armies famously exploded. In 1903, a massive, chaotic gun battle erupted right under the 2nd Avenue L train. Imagine the sheer narrative tension here. Hundreds of armed men from Eastman and Kelly's crews exchanging relentless gunfire in the shadows of the elevated tracks. They terrified civilians and completely overwhelmed the police. It really brings the terrifying reality of their rivalry to life. Yet, these historical figures were vastly more complex than simple villains. Take the fascinating paradox of Monk Eastman. Sure, he was a ruthless underworld boss who ruled with an iron fist. But he also had a bizarrely tender side. He deeply loved and kept pigeons and cats at his pet shop. And incredibly, he later overcame his criminal past to serve his country, becoming a decorated hero in World War I. Come on, you just can't write historical fiction that fascinating. Section 3. Hollywood fiction versus reality, deconstructing the myth. Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is how it dissects the pop culture lore that TV and film have completely ingrained in our minds. The historical facts actively debunk those romanticized illusions. The myth tells us these gangs had uniform razor caps. The reality? They had distinct ethnic styles prioritizing pure toughness over uniform fashion. The myth paints them as purely chaotic thugs, but reality reveals highly disciplined crews with structured, business-like rackets. And while Hollywood often shows mono-ethnic crews, the true New York underworld was highly multi-ethnic. It blended Jewish, Irish, and Italian immigrants into incredibly powerful networks. Section 4. Birth of Organized Crime, from street brawlers to syndicate bosses. So how exactly did these brutal gangs transform their raw street power into sophisticated business models? Well, they evolved through an entrepreneurial ladder. Step 1 was establishing street dominance and running local protection rackets. Step 2 was monetizing this muscle, hiring themselves out during the labor slugger wars. Step 3, aligning with corrupt politicians to act as enforcers for Tammany Hall. And finally, Step 4, fully professionalizing into Prohibition-era syndicates. They realized that violence could be directly monetized through politics and labor unions. The pivotal turning point happens in the 1920s. The unstructured chaos of the streets needed a mastermind, and figures like Arnold Rothstein stepped up. Rothstein brilliantly bridged the gap between raw street thugs and national multi-million-dollar criminal syndicates. He was essentially the architect who took the gangland grit of the 5 points and molded it into the polished foundations of modern organized crime. Section 5. Legacy of the Underworld. Ambition against the odds. Looking back, we have to reflect on the lasting cultural impact of these incredibly ambitious figures. We remain deeply connected to this history even today. In 2026, our cultural obsession continues with the premiere of the new Peaky Blinders film, The Immortal Man. Simultaneously, MGM Plus is developing The Westies, a show explicitly styled in this vein, focusing on the 1980s Irish gangs of Hell's Kitchen. It just proves our enduring global fascination with underworld resilience. So the crucial point is this: it's the ultimate immigrant success story in the underworld. They were turning desperation into power, territory into empires, and street smarts into lasting legends. These crews filled power vacuums in slums where legitimate avenues were entirely blocked off to them. It is a profound sociological concept of survival, adaptability, and brutal upward mobility. Which leaves us with this provocative final question to ponder. Are these legends simply tales of brutal criminality, or are they the rawest, unfiltered reflection of the American dream? There is an incredibly thin line between crime and ambition, between desperation and building an empire. Think about that the next time you watch one of these underworld stories unfold on screen. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep feeding that curiosity, and I'll catch you next time.